Later, as the bells rang across the mountains, Matteo walked alone down the plaza. He passed the spot where the machete had fallen, where his blood had stained the stones. He paused, touching the scar on his hand. For years he had believed he was cursed, destined to be like his father. Angry, violent, empty. But now, in the stillness, he heard again the words that had changed him forever. "You were not born to destroy." He smiled through tears. For the first time, the words no longer felt impossible. They felt true. But that moment, that transformation, had come at a cost. It had required him to face the ugliest parts of himself in the presence of something so holy it should have destroyed him. Instead, it had saved him. The village of Santo Domingo sat between two ridges, small and forgotten by most of the world. The people there lived simply, their lives measured by harvests and seasons and the ringing of church bells that marked each day's rhythm. At the center of everything stood the church, modest but sacred, with an altar that had weathered decades of devotion. Matteo had hated that altar for as long as he could remember. He hated what it represented. Peace he'd never known. Forgiveness he'd never received. Hope he'd stopped believing in when his father's fists taught him that mercy was for the weak. Matteo had been drinking that night. Not enough to excuse what he was about to do, but enough to silence the last whisper of doubt that still lived somewhere deep inside him. The cantina had closed hours ago, but he'd sat alone in the darkness, staring at the bottle, thinking about his father. His father who'd beaten his mother until she stopped crying, stopped speaking, stopped living in any way that mattered. His father who taught him that the world was divided into two kinds of people, those who took what they wanted and those who suffered for being weak. His father who died angry and alone, cursing God with his final breath. Matteo stood from the table, the chair scraping against the floor. The machete hung at his belt, the blade his father had used to clear brush from the fields, to threaten neighbors, to carve fear into anyone who looked at him wrong. Now it was Matteo's, an inheritance of rage. He walked through the empty streets of Santo Domingo. The moon hung low and full, casting silver light across the plaza. Every window was dark. Every door was closed. The village slept, unaware that something terrible was about to happen. The church doors stood open. They always did. Father Miguel believed that God's house should never be locked, that anyone seeking refuge should find it, day or night. Matteo had always thought that was foolish. Weakness inviting destruction. Tonight, destruction had accepted the invitation. The altar stood before him, draped in white cloth, adorned with flowers the village women had placed that morning. Candles flickered in the darkness, their flames casting dancing shadows across the stone walls. Above the altar hung a simple wooden cross, carved by hands long dead, polished by decades of prayer. Matteo pulled the machete from his belt. The blade caught the candlelight, gleaming like a promise of violence. He raised it above his head, muscles tensing, ready to bring it down, ready to shatter the peace this place represented, ready to prove that his father had been right all along. There was no God. There was no mercy. There was only power and those strong enough to wield it. The blade began its descent, and then everything stopped, not slowed, stopped. The candle flames froze mid-flicker. The air became thick, heavy, pressing against him from all sides. Matteo tried to move, tried to complete the swing, but his arms wouldn't respond. His body had become stone. Light filled the church, not the soft glow of candles, but something else entirely. Something that burned without heat, that illuminated without casting shadows. Something that made every atom of Matteo's being scream in recognition and terror. A figure stood between him and the altar. Not emerged, not appeared. Simply was, as if he'd always been there and Matteo had only now gained the ability to see him. The figure spoke without words, and Matteo understood without hearing. The message bypassed language entirely, written directly onto his soul. You were not born to destroy. The machete fell from Matteo's hand, clattering against the stone floor with a sound that seemed to echo through eternity. Time resumed its flow. The candle flames danced again. The air thinned, but nothing was the same. Mateo collapsed to his knees, gasping. His right hand burned with pain so intense he couldn't comprehend it at first. He looked down and saw blood welling from his palm, flowing in thick rivulets down his wrist, dripping onto the stones below. The wound was deep, precise, as if something infinitely sharp had pierced straight through the center of his hand. But nothing had touched him, nothing visible. The figure was gone. The light had faded. The church returned to its quiet darkness, illuminated only by candles that flickered as if nothing extraordinary had happened. Yet everything had changed. Mateo could feel it in his bones, in his blood, in the very fabric of his being. He had been marked, not punished. Marked. The distinction was crucial, though he couldn't yet articulate why. The pain in his hand wasn't retribution. It was reminder. It was covenant. It was proof that what had just occurred was real, not hallucination born of alcohol and rage. Blood pooled on the plaza stones beneath the church entrance where he'd crawled, unable to stand, unable to process what mercy looked like when it wore the face of the divine. He'd come to destroy. Instead, he'd been destroyed and remade in the same eternal moment. Dawn broke over Santo Domingo, painting the mountains gold and red. Mateo still knelt in the church entrance, his hand wrapped in cloth torn from his own shirt. The bleeding had stopped, but the wound remained, a perfect circle through his palm that would scar into permanent testimony. He understood now what he'd been. Not strong, not powerful, cursed, following his father's path toward the same angry, empty death. Every act of violence, every moment of rage, every time he'd chosen destruction over creation, he'd been building his own prison. Brick by brick, choice by choice. His father had told him the world was divided into two kinds of people. He'd been wrong. The world was divided into those who chose mercy and those who chose judgment. Those who built and those who destroyed. Those who loved and those who hated. Mateo had spent his entire life on the wrong side of every divide. The voice had shown him something in that frozen moment. Not words, not images, understanding. He'd seen his life as it truly was. Small, mean, predictable, a cheap copy of his father's failures. He'd seen the path stretching ahead, leading to the same bitter end, dying alone and angry, cursing a God he claimed not to believe in. And he'd seen another path, narrow, difficult, requiring him to become someone he'd never been. Someone who chose differently. Someone who broke the cycle instead of perpetuating it. Someone reborn. Father Miguel found him as the sun climbed higher. The old priest stopped in the church doorway, taking in the scene. Mateo on his knees, blood on the stones, the machete lying forgotten on the floor, the altar standing untouched. The priest's eyes moved from the blade to the wounded hand to Mateo's face, and something in that weathered expression shifted. Not fear, recognition. He'd seen this before, perhaps, or heard stories. Moments when heaven touched earth and left marks that couldn't be explained away. What happened here? Father Miguel's voice was quiet, careful, like approaching a wounded animal. Mateo looked up, and the priest took an involuntary step back. Something in those eyes had changed. The rage was gone. The emptiness was gone. In their place burned something else entirely. Certainty, terror, wonder, all mixed together in proportions that shouldn't coexist, but somehow did. I came to destroy your altar. Mateo's voice cracked. I raised the blade. I wanted to prove there was no God, no mercy, nothing but power in those strong enough to take it. He paused, touching his wounded hand with trembling fingers. But he was there. He stopped me. He marked me. He told me I wasn't born to destroy. The words tumbled out now, faster, desperate to be spoken before doubt could creep back in. Father Miguel listened without interrupting, without judgment, his face grave and attentive. Around them, Santo Domingo began to wake. Doors opened. Voices carried across the plaza. Soon others would come. Soon the questions would begin. By midday, the church was filled with villagers. They came because word had spread the way it always did in Santo Domingo, quickly, carried on whispers and speculation. Mateo, the church, blood, a miracle. Some came curious. Some came skeptical. Some came hoping. They gathered in the pews, standing along the walls, crowding the doorway. Mateo sat in the front row, his wounded hand resting in his lap, Father Miguel beside him. "Tell them." The priest's voice was gentle but firm. "Tell them what happened." Mateo stood, facing people who'd known him his entire life. People who'd feared him. People who'd crossed the street when they saw him coming. People who remembered his father and assumed the son would be no different. "I came here last night to destroy the altar." His voice carried through the church, steady despite the trembling in his chest. "I wanted to prove that faith was weakness. That God was a lie. That mercy was for fools." He held up his wounded hand so everyone could see. But when I raised the blade, he appeared, not in my imagination, not in a dream. He was here, real as any of you. The light, it filled everything. Time stopped, and he spoke to me without words, told me I wasn't born to destroy. Silence filled the church. Then Elena Vargas, the baker's wife who'd once refused to sell him bread after he'd threatened her husband, spoke. "Why should we believe you? You're a violent man, Mateo. Like your father. Maybe you're just afraid now. Maybe this is a trick." Mateo met Elena's eyes without anger, without the defensive rage that would have consumed him days ago. "I don't blame you for doubting. I would doubt too. I've given you every reason to fear me, no reason to trust me." He gestured toward the altar, still draped in white, still adorned with flowers, still standing exactly as it had for decades. "But look, the altar stands. I came to destroy it with this." He pointed to the machete that Father Miguel had placed on a table near the entrance. "I raised that blade with every intention of shattering what you hold sacred. And I couldn't do it. Not because I changed my mind. Not because I suddenly grew a conscience. Because he stopped me. Because he showed me mercy I didn't deserve, grace I couldn't earn, forgiveness I never asked for." The wound in Mateo's hand throbbed with each heartbeat, a constant reminder of what had transpired. Father Miguel stood, his voice carrying the weight of authority earned through decades of service. "I've been priest of this church for 40 years. I've seen many things. I've heard many confessions. I've witnessed much suffering and occasional joy. But I've never seen a man transformed like this." The old priest walked to the altar, placing his hand on the white cloth. "This altar has weathered storms, earthquakes, the passage of time. It has survived because it represents something that cannot be destroyed by violence or hatred. It represents faith. And faith, true faith, doesn't fear the questions of skeptics. It welcomes them." The days that followed became their own kind of testimony. Mateo didn't hide. He walked through Santo Domingo with his wounded hand visible, meeting the stares and whispers with quiet dignity. He helped old Senora Martinez carry her groceries when her arthritis flared. He repaired the fence at the schoolyard that he'd kicked down in a drunken rage 2 months prior. He sat in the plaza each evening, available to anyone who wanted to talk, to question, to challenge. Some villagers kept their distance, unconvinced that a man could change so completely so quickly. Diego Herrera, whose brother Mateo had beaten badly a year ago, spat at his feet when they crossed paths. Mateo didn't retaliate, didn't even flinch. He simply said, "I'm sorry for what I did to Carlos. I can't undo it, but I can be different now." Diego walked away without responding, but 3 days later, he showed up at Mateo's door. "My brother wants to talk to you. Not forgive. Not yet, but talk." Others watched with cautious curiosity. Rosa Delgado, who taught at the village school, observed Mateo helping children fix a broken swing. The man who'd once terrified her students now made them laugh. The transformation seemed impossible, yet she witnessed it daily. Father Miguel kept close watch, not from distrust, but from pastoral care. He knew that dramatic conversions often face dramatic challenges, that the enemy prowled like a lion, seeking whom he might devour, that old patterns died hard and temptation whispered loudest to the newly faithful. 2 weeks after the encounter, Mateo sat alone in his small house on the edge of Santo Domingo. Night had fallen. The candle on his table cast flickering shadows across the walls. He held his right hand in his left, fingers tracing the scar that had formed. A perfect circle, pale against his skin, marking him forever. He remembered the moment with perfect clarity, the light, the presence, the overwhelming sense of being fully known and fully loved, despite being fully unworthy. The voice that spoke without sound, writing truth directly onto his soul. You were not born to destroy. Such simple words. But they'd shattered everything he believed about himself. His father had told him he was cursed, that violence was in his blood, that rage was his inheritance and his destiny. Mateo had believed it, had lived it, had become the monster his father promised he would be. But the voice had said something different, something that reached back before his father's poison, before the beatings and the broken furniture and the nights cowering in corners. Back to the beginning, to intention, to design, to purpose. Not born to destroy, born for something else, something better, something redemptive. The scar pulsed with warmth, not pain. A reminder rather than a punishment. A covenant rather than a curse. He'd been marked the way ancient priests were marked, set apart for service, claimed for a purpose higher than himself. Mateo closed his eyes and whispered the prayer that had become his constant companion. Help me be who you made me to be, not who my father said I was. Sunday morning arrived bright and clear. The bells of Santo Domingo rang across the mountains, calling the faithful to Mass, their sound carrying over ridges and valleys, announcing something more than routine worship. Word had spread beyond the village. People from neighboring towns made the journey to see the man who'd tried to destroy the altar and been stopped by God himself. The church filled beyond capacity. Villagers who hadn't attended Mass in years came. Skeptics came. Believers came. The curious came. They packed the pews, lined the walls, stood in the doorway, and spilled out into the plaza. Father Miguel had never seen such a crowd. Mateo sat in the front row, his scarred hand resting on his knee. He wore simple clothes, clean but worn. Nothing about his appearance suggested holiness or authority. He looked like what he was, a man being rebuilt from broken pieces, still rough at the edges, still learning how to live in his new skin. During the homily, Father Miguel spoke about mercy, about how God's grace reaches into the darkest places, about how no one is beyond redemption, about how the altar that Mateo had tried to destroy now stood stronger than ever, not because it was physically reinforced, but because it represented something that violence could never touch. After the service, the congregation didn't rush to leave. They gathered around the altar, touching it, praying over it, celebrating what it represented. Elena Vargas, who'd challenged Mateo weeks ago, approached him with tears in her eyes. I believe you now. I see it in how you live. Later, as the bells rang across the mountains, Mateo walked alone down the plaza. He passed the spot where the machete had fallen, where his blood had stained the stones. He paused, touching the scar on his hand. For years he had believed he was cursed, destined to be like his father. Angry, violent, empty. But now, in the stillness, he heard again the words that had changed him forever. You were not born to destroy. He smiled through tears. For the first time, the words no longer felt impossible. They felt true. And in that village tucked between the hills, a new chapter had begun. Not because one man was perfect, but because mercy had reached him and through him touched them all. The altar stood taller than ever, not just in stone and flowers, but in the faith it represented, a faith no longer fragile, but living. A faith that had faced hatred and answered with love. That was Mateo's legacy. That was Santo Domingo's legacy. And perhaps it could be ours too. The scar on his hand would remain forever, a reminder of the night everything changed. When he raised a blade in anger and met something stronger than violence. When he came to destroy and was instead rebuilt. When mercy proved more powerful than judgment. Children would ask him about it someday. He would tell them the truth, that he was marked by grace, that he was chosen not for perfection, but for transformation, that anyone could be remade if they surrendered to the one who made them. The legacy of grace was still being written, one life at a time.